Guten Morgen and herzlich willkommen, a very warm welcome to Alec Empire.
Hi.
The video we just saw is from 1999, I think, a demonstration against the NATO invasion in Kosovo.
Not invasion, it was like the bombings.
Bombings.
But yeah.
You're right.
No, it was, but it's not only that, I mean, the real reason for this protest, because in that year it was really different to the normal 1st May protest you see every year, was because in Germany many people were very concerned with the idea of Germany's active involvement in wars, international wars. You know, before that year, Germany never participated in wars actively after the Second World War. So it was a very big deal when the Social Democratic government and the Green Party introduced the option that Germany should become this powerful player again in the world. So a lot of people were very angry, of course, because of the Second World War and so on. So I think the context is really important when we watch this video. So it's not just the 1st May protest that you see every year. So it was about something for us very serious at the time.
You were born 1972 in Reinickendorf, right?
Yeah, I mean, like I grew up there. The hospital was in Charlottenburg. This is where most
West Berlin,
babies
in either case,
were born. Exactly. So sometimes there's the confusion. People look it up and go, Charlottenburg, he's like the bourgeois, rich kid guy, whatever. But the thing is, many, were born there. So
basically, like, you were 18 more or less when the wall came down. But before that, as a teenager, seeing that, well, this is another 10 years later and highly political. But as a teenager, was politics a direct influence of your creative work, or was music sort of first without the politics?
Yes, no, I mean, for me, politics and music were connected for my whole life. I mean, this has something to do with the history of my family. You know, my grandfather was killed in a concentration camp. So, you know, when you grow up and you ask yourself certain questions, okay, what happened? How could this happen? I grew up in the Berlin that was divided by a war, you know, so we had some relatives in East Berlin. So it has a huge influence on the way you see the world, you know. So for me, music had to be political. Not all music, of course, but I thought music always plays a role in public life, and therefore it's important what the music is about, you know. And I noticed very early on that certain people want to take that away from music, and they have bad intentions when they want to destroy meaning of music, and they love to sell meaningless entertainment, and they go, hey, artists should stay out of politics, or they should not make a statement. So I think that's very dangerous. I mean, we hear this all the time still. You know, I think it was always the case that creative people were under attack because they could build a bridge to a large amount of people, could present certain ideas that could change people's lives, actually. Some people might be cynical and go, yeah, but which song ever changed somebody's life? Maybe not the song itself, but the way you suddenly see the world in another, through another lens maybe, or through another filter, is key here, you know. So let's say, to give you an example, the 80s, okay, I was a young kid, I was really into early hip-hop music, Grandmaster Flash, Africa Bambaataa, that kind of stuff. It was being played on the American radio stations here in Berlin, which was a big advantage to some of the rest of Germany, because many people in other parts of Germany didn't hear that music so early on. And I think maybe that also plays a role later on what happened with the club culture and stuff. So for me, listening to that music, I saw a different America than I saw on television. And I mean, Chuck D from Public Enemy said this, I think also in the 80s. It's like we try to be the black CNN or something like that. I don't exactly remember the quote, but it was something like that. And so this is an example of how you might have certain views about certain groups in the population. When you hear their music, suddenly maybe you develop some sort of empathy, some different understanding. You understand where they're coming from. So music is very important when it comes to that.
Were you aware of, well, either music or radio happening outside of the West Berlin island? Was there any contact?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I grew up in West Berlin. I think that's important to mention. So, yes, technically, in a way, I mean, we were occupied by the Americans, British, and French, and then there was East Berlin. But the thing was, it felt like an island because the moment you drove, I don't know, like half hour or something, you reached the border. So, and you had to go through East Germany. So it felt very claustrophobic. Sometimes people go, yeah, but you guys were allowed to travel and you had a lot of advantages that people in the East didn't have, which is true. But in everyday life, I think the feeling of not being able, for example, what everybody takes now for granted, to go, okay, it's summer, let's go to some lake, or let's see nature, what's outside of Berlin. That was all closed off. There were people with machine guns standing there guarding us. So, I mean, but it was this weird thing because, like, I think now when we talk about immigration and borders and America and wars and stuff, people always think it's about people from the outside not being allowed to come in, but with East and West Germany, it was such a bizarre situation where the population on the East was kept hostage and couldn't leave, and it's a very special environment, I think, and that's why. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but it's probably a lot more musicians from that era think like that. I'm very sensitive to. When the government becomes too powerful, when surveillance technology is used to spy on people, and the invasion of privacy, all these things, we've seen it, how bad it can get, So that's why this matters so much to us.
Talking about Berlin in the 80s, just before the wall came down, who is important to you? Were there any figures? Because we actually had Alexander Hacker of Einstürzende Neubauten speaking here just 2 days ago, so I'm kind of curious if that was a world that you were aware of.
Sure. I mean, I was in the very early age in the sort of punk scene, which the reality was, you played a show in squats and I mean, all the typical small punk clubs. It's for some reason I was right there, like when this happened. I mean, I was 12, 13 years old, and we opened up for these punk bands, which would become very big later on. I mean, I don't know, Die Totenhosen or Die Ärzte, those types of bands, and they were maybe playing to 400 or 500 people, and I think now some of these bands would fill maybe even a stadium, I don't know. But it was a very small scene. But I have to say, what I didn't like, and I never liked this at the time, was the sort of nihilism that was around. Because there was no perspective, I mean, the fascinating thing I think about the 80s in Berlin was that it felt like people there was nowhere to go into the future. And I think, to me, the music that was made in Berlin at the time really reflects that. And I felt really different. You know, for me, I mentioned hip-hop early on. It was this, no, we need to get out of this place. We need to do something better. We don't want to accept this situation. This is very different to this older generation, who was more about, okay, like, let's experiment, I don't know. I mean, okay, I think, for example, when we talk about music, I think there's one big difference between the 80s and the 90s. I think the 80s, and it has something to do with the computer being the central big step in evolution at some point, you know, that came in and was becoming more important. But I think the 80s was a lot about chaos and destruction and like, I mean, banging on burning trash cans and stuff like that, which is an interesting thing in a way. But I think my generation, we were about, okay, how can we take that and control it? You know, how can we use technology to actually not just do something chaotic, but to put a certain order to the chaos, so we do something with the audience. And I think, I mean, when you look at videos maybe, or old film from 80s concerts, you don't really see a lot of people moving, for example. Very often people stand there and they maybe hold a beer and or something, and maybe they throw something or they shout something. But it's, when you compare that to footage just, let's say, 3-4 years later, the big raves, where you see, I don't know, 5,000 people dancing, it's a huge difference. So the wall coming down in '89 is almost like it seizes the time. You know, there's like the Berlin before the wall came down and then after. And I belong more to the generation, I think, of where after the wall came down, even though I was already active in the music scene before.
A lot of people, though, sort of have this reproach towards techno, or specifically Berlin techno of the 90s, that it's so like not political at all. But you were saying it actually was political while people were dancing.
I thought in the beginning it had something political about it. And of course I declared it dead, I think, in early 1992. where I was, this is going in the wrong direction.
Still going, sorry.
It's a good question if this is the same thing that's still going. You know? I mean, but maybe we get to that later. Because, okay, the reason why I was fascinated by acid house and early techno, and I was one of these guys. I was like, no, we have to be anonymous. We can't have our hardest names on the records. It has to be all white labels. It has to be, track titles. Why even coming up with track titles? It should be numbers. You know, it should be just the music. And we are tired of the slogans and the empty kind of political messages that at the time I really felt tired of what was going on in the political left, I have to say. I mean, I hated the right, of course, but I felt like towards the end of the 80s, a lot of the stuff that was coming from the left in places like Kreuzberg and, where most of these things were happening in the 80s, for me, it was empty. It didn't have any meaning. We saw on one side, for example, the GDR collapsing, and people still, you see them now still, on the 1st May, you see people with a hammer and sickle flag, and I'm like, how many more times do you want to see this stuff fail? Like, and you're still repeating this nonsense, So I was immediately like very on this sort of anarchist freedom side, like we do what we want, like we have to control everything ourselves, self-determination and so on. So there was this big conflict brewing, So that's why I was identifying with the early techno stuff. The problem was In the beginning, it was freaks and outsiders who loved that stuff. And, for example, the club Tresor opened up, and they kind of imported these Detroit DJs.
I think they opened in '92 or so.
Yeah, I mean, like end of, I think, 91 or something. At that time, it was, the thing was that, let's say, Underground Resistance, Jeff Mills, all these guys, they were not what you would consider mainstream techno a few years later, because nobody cared about that music in America, So it was this weird, almost maybe mistaken nature and evolution, or I don't know, that there is the place, Berlin, the wall is coming down. At some point, like there was this open space. It was, the governments didn't know what to do. The authorities were like, okay, what is this house? We don't even know who owns this house. So you would have these free spaces. But the music that was so relevant was not the music of the Berlin of the 80s. It was done by producers in Detroit. And sometimes when I speak about this with friends and other musicians, in theory, it doesn't make any sense. Like, why do Germans, mostly Germans, I would say, in Berlin at the time, pick music from Detroit that was done by, these underground people? Why didn't they pick reggae music from Jamaica? Or Russian or something, whatever. Like, they could have picked anything, but they picked this. And it's an interesting question that nobody could answer so far. But there was something, for some reason, maybe there was this connection between how people in Detroit felt and how we felt in Berlin when we saw a system collapse in front of our eyes. And everything changed. I mean, people now, maybe younger people, can't imagine what that feels like. Like, even though I was from the West, to see such a radical change happen in society. And you see, like a year earlier, people were like, "No, this will go on forever. Oh my God, these speeches and so on. This will probably never end." It was like a definition of in East Germany. I mean, because you could see that on television, and you go, "Okay, that you want to buy a car, you need to wait 20 years to get it, but everything is great still." So it was an absurd scenario. That didn't make any sense. So, but it didn't feel like, oh, a year later, we can go into all these warehouses and create music that actually was completely fresh and new, So you
were totally surprised when the wall came down. There was like absolutely no way that you could have felt that, or that in sort of the music or art scene, you anticipated that before.
No, I remember there's a very good film called, I just know the German title, Flüstern und Schreien, it's called. It's about the GDR. It was like a documentary filmmaker who went into East Germany and filmed certain bands, interviewed them, and so on. And I saw that, I don't know exactly when that was. It was maybe 88 or something. I'm not so sure. We have to look it up. But around that time, okay. And he was able to get some interviews with musicians who were not actually allowed to perform in public, and so on. And it felt like, wow, these people, they are real kind of rebels almost. Because, people don't know. And in the GDR, you had to get this permission. You had to play in front of a jury or something, a committee, and then they would tell you, is that okay? Is this a threat to the people or whatever? Like, you have to hand in your lyrics and so on. They would even tell you how much you're supposed to earn. A total nightmare, I think. People often, I think in our age, don't understand these ideas, certain ideas that are also being talked about in our time now, when it's like, for example, let's say, you get this all the time, right? You're a musician. There's one guy you absolutely hate this person. Like it's shitty music. It's bad. Why is this musician earning more than I do? It's not fair, right? I mean, I guess every musician had this at some point. It's like, this is not good. Why do people pick that? And why is this person rewarded with millions maybe of dollars or something? But anyway, what you want instead, you want what I just described, that you have some bureaucrats sitting there. Okay, maybe you should earn 10 euros per hour, and your concert is an hour long. So, but this was the reality there, you know, and people don't, you know, it's a total nightmare. So, but when you watch this documentary, for example, you don't get the sense that, I mean, these people were like, it felt like everybody was stuck. There was nowhere to go from there, you know. Maybe later on I always thought, okay, maybe when you feel like that, maybe then just change is around the corner somehow, you know. So because I had this in other situations in my own life where I was like, okay, why is no progress? You know, I want to do this, and so it's also maybe even making music can be like that. You know, you feel stuck. You have a certain idea, and for some reason you don't get to that point, and you go, why is this machine not doing what I want? You know, and then. But then suddenly you take a short break, and then you have the idea, and you go, hey, wait a minute, okay, no. You don't tell me what to do. It should be the other way around, you know.
I want to play a bit of music in a minute, but one question before. Would you just, so like the video we watched in the beginning, and then you speaking about the techno scene and Trezor, I think to a lot of people, either from a perspective not coming from Berlin or from a perspective just like knowing the music scene nowadays, thinking about punk and squats, or maybe a very political, being very political, and techno being one thing that is, you know, for a lot of people that doesn't go together at all, that like punk and techno would be one, but it always was for you.
Yeah, it was an option for me. I mean, okay, when I was in the techno underground, I noticed something very early on. And I didn't like that at all, and it was this. Okay, we have to escape reality. You know, we're in this club or at this rave or whatever, and you even hear this. I mean, if you look at old interviews, maybe footage, people say, you know, for a few hours, I want to leave my life behind and so on.
Escapism, yeah.
Exactly. So, and I guess that's still the same thing for most people, maybe, who go to a club, take drugs. They don't want to worry or something about other stuff that is happening in their lives. To me, that was always very strange. I was like, oh, let's confront what we don't like in our lives. We need to solve the problems. For example, racism, okay? Like, back in the day, what we saw was like when the wall came down, and this led to Atari Teenage Riot, the band, very fast, because we saw that there were a lot of neo-Nazis in the east of Germany. Of course, in the GDR, like, these people didn't exist because everybody was a socialist, of course, you know. So after the wall came down, suddenly you saw all these, like, and extremely violent. Like, I mean, I was in fights with Nazi skinheads in West Berlin, for example, but they were, compared to the guys from the East, they were like, yeah, it was like if you watch maybe a movie like Quadrophenia, you know, it was like mods versus rockers and versus punks. It was like, yeah, you had sort of like a street fight, but it was not about, hey, you're on the floor, I'm going to stamp on your head until you're dead. You know, like, I mean, it wasn't that kind of, you know.
Actual violence.
Yeah, I mean, stuff like this also happened, but it wasn't the majority. I think what was the difference was like that there was like such a militant far right wing in the East, where we were like, okay, this is a totally different level of a threat, because you know, like, I mean, we saw these attacks on asylum homes, you know, like stuff like that. And, you know, what you do, like, right? I mean, this stuff happens, you hear about it, you're shocked, you know, they're throwing firebombs through windows, and there's like babies in the room, you know, and you go, I mean, which person, you can disagree with the politics as much as you want, but there's no legitimization for this behavior. I mean, sorry, you know, like we were outraged. We go to the clubs, to the raves, and people are like, yeah, it's a bit bad, but now let's have a party, you know. And this kind of thing drove me crazy. I was like, wait a minute, this is happening outside, and you're just pretending. Suddenly, these sort of like people I also knew from the punk scene, because a lot of the early techno guys were coming from the punk scene in the 80s. Suddenly, they behaved like these hypocritical hippies, you know, who were like, no, like, come on, peace, you know, like, let's have a party. We don't want this. And it reminded me of these. I mean, maybe you know this. You go to a family thing or something, and there's a disagreement about politics, and suddenly there's a few family members who go, let's not talk about, I don't know, Donald Trump or something like that. You know, like, I mean, I think everybody knows this. And it was the same, like, family kind of weird peer pressure thing to sweep stuff under the carpet that, you know, and I thought, this is bad. And I actually make the direct link to what happened at the Love Parade in 2010, you know, like, how people never confronted those people who organized this stuff, never hold them accountable, you know, like, or responsible. There was always this weird herd mentality, you know, and I always felt threatened by that.
What happened at the Love Parade in 2000? Was it 2010?
Yes,
I think when it was in West Germany, is that people got
stamped to death.
Got stamped to death, yeah. Actually. But talking about the Love Parade, I think coincidentally the first Love Parade was just before the wall came down in '89, under this in famous motto Friede, Freude, Eierkuchen, just sort of like peace, love, pancakes, or whatever. So were you opposed to that happening?
No. I was at these events. I loved it. I mean, like, for example, okay, imagine this. All my friends were punks, okay, at the time. I was the only guy. I was even the only guy in my school, like, who listened to this music. And people were like, what are you listening to? There's just like a boom, 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 like, I don't know, and is somebody singing at some point? I mean, now it sounds like a cliche joke, but it was like that. These were the normal types of people who listened to whatever, rock music. The punks, like my punk friends, saw it immediately as a threat. They were like, hey, this is computer music, this is dehumanized and blah, 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 you know, and this is capitalistic and so on, you know, so... and so there was this really hostile environment where everybody hated that music. And for example, in my opinion, I mean, this is how I treated the first Love Parades, maybe the first 2-3 ones that I went to. It was for me like almost like a trigger, you know. I was like, hey, you know, we are doing this protest. You want to come? Like, what is it about? You know, is it against Starbucks or whatever? You know, it's like, no, it's about this. People would, you know, their faces would turn red. This doesn't mean anything. You're making a mockery of our movement and so on. So, and I always loved that. I mean, maybe if you look at my discography and stuff, I always love offensive stuff. You know, like also, I mean, I always, as a DJ, I loved collecting records with like the weirdest sleeve designs, or, you know, the artwork, or even the music itself, like anything that would kind of trigger people, and because you confront them with something that is against the way they view the world, you know. Because I think music, this is the danger, I think, about music. It can become a soundtrack to traditions and rules, you know. And I mean, like, for example, we know it from, let's say, the military. You know, everybody marches to the same rhythm. It can be used to make to create conformity. The weird thing is, if you look at certain footage of raves, a little bit later in the 90s, we always call it like marching music, because a lot of people dance almost like the same way, you know. And I was like, wait, this is weird. This is, before that was kind of slightly chaotic, and everybody was free, and then suddenly you had to dress a certain way. This was the dance moves you were allowed to make. And it was, to me, that was just really boring. And then, of course, at some point, when this dominated culture, we felt this was similar to cultural fascism almost, you know, because we felt there's no room, no freedom anymore, because the DJs were like, this is how you have to arrange your tracks, so they get played. Before that, the DJs were looking for records they could play. in a way that they were like, okay, I have to actually get involved. I don't want the records to be easy to play. I mean, you want good records, of course, but it was a challenge. When you saw a good DJ, it's like, wow, he's mixing that record with that. I wouldn't even have thought of that, you know. But then it became like, okay, it has to be at this tempo. It has to. This is the, you know, the intro. You have to leave that length in the beginning, so it's easy to. And I was like, this is becoming just rules. There was less options than ever before, and this is always when I'm kind of out, you know. I'm like, okay, this is not for me, so you guys can go ahead, but
I was thinking to play a track of your digital hardcore release, the single called Digital Hardcore. Should we play Pleasure is Our Business? Because that's kind of what he talked about earlier.
Okay, why did you play this one? Okay.
Actually, sort of as a tongue-in-cheek comment on what we were talking about earlier, that you said, well, the way that people were sort of perceiving pleasure, or someone showing pleasure at the dance floor, was kind of, you know, it was a difficult thing. And this track was called Pleasure is Our Business. And you sort of, well, you're saying that is what we're actually doing. We are playing for pleasure, and that doesn't mean that we're not political. But when I would say we, at the time, obviously, this was around when you started playing with Atari Teenage Riot.
Yeah. Like, I mean, this track was from 1994. I mean, it was done in 1993, end of 1993. This is the first release on digital hardcore recordings, which is, yeah, I don't know what the question was, but I think it's important, because at that point I was like, okay, I'm the anti-techno guy. You know, like we were all dressed in complete black. We were, I mean, the only link back into the techno scene was we were doing these raves with the Spiral Tribe at Potsdamer Platz when they had to flee England. They came first to Berlin, and we hooked up and made these kind of like.
Why did they have to flee England?
Because of the criminal justice bill, and because, I mean, they were doing these illegal raves in fields, and yeah, the government wanted to crack down on this stuff because I mean, there's a really good chapter in the book by Simon Reynolds, Energy Flash, where he did an interview with me a year later, and he took a lot of the stuff I told him, and he described it very well, and he did some more research, and it was interesting how the brewing companies, we had Red Bull now, but I mean, it was like beer companies, alcohol companies actually, who didn't like the rave scene. You know, for them it's like, what are these people drinking? They drink water and energy drinks. They don't consume our stuff, so, and they take some pills or whatever. So, and they saw it as a threat to their business, because before rock festivals there was beer everywhere, alcohol, you know. So there was like the bigger picture was quite interesting. How, I mean, because these raves were big, you know, it's like 10, 20,000 people in some cornfield somewhere, you know. So a lot of people saw like their businesses, you know, like going down maybe, or like if this grows further, it will take over,
So you brought them to Berlin and did raves
No, I
with
didn't
them.
bring them. They left with all their trucks. They had trucks and stuff. They were like kind of like, I mean, yeah, they called themselves the Spiral Tribe, and they were like a sort of like tribal kind of.
Yeah, they played in places like ex-Yugoslavia.
Yeah,
and
that's
did
when
like
they
raves
went after.
where-
Yeah, they went to further east. Yeah, when Potsdamer Platz, they started building what you see now, the Sony Center and all this stuff. It was like a wasteland. I mean, at that time, I remember we were making music that it was like it was the old part. The wall was not just actually one wall. There was like. Some space in between. If you would climb the first fence or something, then you have to run over like certain landmines, and they could shoot you in the back. And this is where they parked the trucks, and this was also where, like, right around the corner where Tresor was, the old Tresor. Tresor had more.
And Hansa Studios and.
Yeah, like all this. Yeah, like now. I mean, it's quite interesting. If you are at Sony Center. There is like, I don't know if when you walk in from the U-Bahn station, there's like an architecture thing where a very old building is like integrated with all this modern stuff, and this building was there, like sort of like ruins of it or something. And imagine us parking the trucks around there and hanging out, doing a campfire. It was very Mad Max. I mean, I have to say, it was like all sand. We had to watch the machines that they don't get, not so much sand is getting into them and stuff. It was a good time.
And talking about Atari Teenage Riot again, was Hanine Elia sort of part of your crew, or before you started making music together? You know each other first?
Yeah, I mean, I ran into her. Actually, when the war, I mean, in those days when the wall came down, it was I was, like everyone, you kind of climbed around, and then people were demolishing the wall, and there was, it was a very exciting time the first weeks after that. So, and I saw her and a friend. I mean, I saw two people in full astronaut outfits, like the helmets, so on. And it was her and some other guy. So, and I was like, hey, like, who are you? And I always had this idea, I want to start this group. I want to bring punk, the energy of punk, together with, like, at the time it was more like acid house and hip hop. So, and it seemed like she was on board with that. And then I remembered Carl Craig, who was kind of like from my area where I grew up. So, and I recruited him. It was really, I used the word recruiting because now, for example, Carl, he told me later on, it was like very strange. I approached him in this public space. I saw him and I was like, hey, this is the mission. We're going to create music to fight fascism. Are you in or not? And he's like, whoa. Okay, like, let's go, So, because I was, at that time, I have to add, I was really tired of the sort of anti-fascist action stuff, like the street fights. I thought, okay, we need to. This doesn't go anywhere. We need to do something else. We need to use computers. Like, we need to use the technology, and try to influence the minds of people. We have to spread the message through music in a way. So these two things kind of came together. That's why I picked music. I was like this. We can fight until the end of days. The stronger person maybe will win, but you don't change somebody's mind. And I think it's a very relevant thing these days again, because I think a lot of people, they get frustrated when they face an opposition. It doesn't even have to be neo-Nazis, and of course you don't have the patience. You hear some dumb stuff and you hear it over and over again, and maybe these people are in the majority, and you go, is there a shortcut maybe? So, and a lot of people go, they pick violence. They go, I just want to smash this guy's head in. But this is not the way to solve this problem, you know? So, and at the time we were like, okay, we need to bring a lot of people together, and the old music just didn't work anymore, you know? It's the punk rock stuff from 10 years earlier sounded very dated, and it didn't sound like our generation, so.
Should we listen to a tiny bit of Hetzjagd auf Nazis to stay in the...
You want to play this? Okay.
No.
I mean, this recording is actually from 1993, and this ended up on the album, which was released in 1995. This was the live recording. We played a really big show in Berlin at the time. You know, you hear the audience was a lot of people. So, but the 12-inch actually came out a year earlier, in 1992, and that's, I think, for a lot of people, that was the key song in a way, because there were these attacks on asylum homes, and where the police deliberately delayed their arrival. They didn't help these people. I think they came like an hour later. The population applauded while neo-Nazis threw these Molotov cocktails through the windows, and so horrible stuff. And now looking back, I mean, maybe it's hard to understand now for people who are younger, but the way we felt was like this, okay? Germany was separated and divided for good reason, because of Nazi Germany and the Second World War. So when Germany got reunified, and we saw a lot of the German flags everywhere, and a lot of people were talking about, we need to find our patriotism again. And then every time you say this stuff, or you hear this stuff, like, you hear these other voices. Yeah, but what about nationalism? And then, you know, like you hear these dark, kind of evil people come out of their holes, and they go, hey, but we are one people again, you know, and so on. And it might sound okay to people now, but at the time it was, when people said this stuff, it was about excluding minorities most of the times. It was like, okay, you don't look German, you don't belong here, and so on. You know, I mean, now I think Germany over the last 20, 30 years tried to give itself a different image. You know, let's see how good that will work out during the next elections, because you see the same kinds of voices, they're getting louder again, you know, since a few years. But so our fear was, and it was I wouldn't say it was paranoid, but we thought there is actually a danger of Germany slipping back into, you know, you have this bad combination of Eastern Germany, you know, where people had a lot of weird education, you know, what they believed about the world and so on, and how the individual doesn't matter and so on. And then you have these far-right people in the West who loved this, you know, they were like, yes, now we are somebody again, you know, now Germany is this powerful force in Europe, and we can tell other countries what to do, and so on. So, and for us, there was always this fear, maybe we're going backwards in time, because the mentality, what we saw in the streets and how people behaved was not like, okay, now we're open to the rest of the world. Now, great, now we can, you know, the other half of the country can travel. This is great, like, you know, there's more freedom now. We saw a lot of people who saw the future of Germany very different. And so when you see this footage on television where neo-Nazi skinheads attack these houses, the police doesn't come to help. And the rest of the population applauds this. For us, this was like the point we were like, okay, now it is getting serious. This is not some very small group of radical neo-Nazis. Now these ideas, are becoming more mainstream again. And I think what is interesting, a lot of people, when we released this, because it caused, I mean, it put us on the blacklist of most raves. People were like, "How dare you? What is this? You can't, this message even,
Some of your music is on the German index, which means that you can't play it on the radio and can't sell it.
You shouldn't have even played it now."
Oh, but we can. We're in a closed space.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That's all right.
Okay.
I checked before, actually.
But still public in a way. Yeah. Okay. So.
But Deutschland has gotta die.
That's another.
You
Yeah.
cannot play, which is another track by them.
Yes. So where were we? So this is why we felt like that. Okay. So and for us, I think what is interesting, this track from 1992, this is on I think it's 170 BPM or something. It doesn't have 4 to the floor bass drums, because at that point we were going, okay, techno as we knew it led to this really bad mainstream version of it, because everybody understood this kind of dumb 4 to the floor rhythm, because also there was less funk at that point in the techno stuff, I have to say. Maybe now when people look back, they always look at, there was Chicago house and there was Detroit, and they look at the good stuff, which is good, but this was like tiny, like it was like the cherries on this ice cream of shit. I mean, it's where it was horrible stuff. I mean, I remember having conversations with people in the record industry, like the old school record industry. They were like telling me, "Look, Alec, the Germans can never dance to funk rhythms like that. They need the 4 to the 4 bass drum."
Did someone actually say that to you?
Who not
was
even
that?
one. This was. I mean, I'm sure if you would go through the archives of old interviews with DJs, they would even say that. They weren't even ashamed to say it. They thought, we got it figured out. This is what the German likes, and and then there was. I mean, it sounds funny, but it's like you saw. I mean. I remember the Love Parade, I think it was 93, where the BBC, at that point, like a lot of the international press paid attention to the Love Parade and to techno in Berlin and Germany and so on. Because it was different to the dance music stuff in England, for example, or France. So, and I remember the BBC, every time they did a report, they came to Berlin about the clubs, whatever. I think maybe because my name starts with A, they had me on this list, and they were always, okay, there's this one guy who disagrees with everything. We need to be kind of objective, so let's call Alec up, And I mean, at that time, I remember during the Love Parade, there was like these DJs, Mark Spoon, I don't know if you know this guy, like he hung out with Böse Onkels, which was this really kind of, I mean, they used to be a neo-Nazi skinhead band, and they became more like a far-right rock band or whatever. So you had a lot of these DJs, they were suddenly really proud that the Germans, we have our music now. And these people were proud of that. I mean, it wasn't like they were. Okay, the way I understood techno was like this. Okay, suddenly we can network with everybody around the world who shares that vision of. Everybody can participate in this, right? I mean, you have the technology. It's about your mind. It's not about physical strength, maybe that you need to play drums or whatever. It's just about like the ideas, and everybody is part of that. It's like a new, more like globalized, maybe international kind of music movement. And I think this is how techno also spread. I think everybody joined in. They were like, hey, we can become a part of this. Suddenly you have people from Brazil or like wherever, Japan and so on. But there was this other narrative, and that went like this. Okay, we were oppressed after the Second World War. the culture from America, from England, was forced upon us. You know, this is not our music, not our identity. Then Kraftwerk came. And Kraftwerk gave birth to techno. Then they do this jump. Maybe they include Giorgio Moroder somehow. You know, then there was Munich. Okay, there was not only Kraftwerk. And then they make this jump to techno. And they leave out funk music, hip-hop, everything that influenced techno. And I think you see this narrative if you read websites or books nowadays. Watch out for this narrative. I think it's very common that people repeat this. And I think they're missing out what techno was about in the beginning and what it should have been about the decades afterwards.
Including what you said earlier, that actually there were a lot of, in the American sector, there were a lot of American radio stations that played music sort of by GI DJs and for GIs in Berlin, also in the area around Frankfurt, Wiesbaden, Hanau, where you had a lot of US Army bases, and that them actually playing funk kind of, you know, formed one of the many, I guess, sources that German techno developed from. But that aside, also in the mid-90s, you decided to relocate to London, or at least partly relocate to there. You had to, because you could not deal with living in Germany anymore?
No, I didn't want to join I didn't want to do the National Army service. I mean, I don't know if that's even interesting, but okay, it was like this. In Berlin, you didn't have to go to the army because we were occupied, you know. So, when people, let's say in Western Germany, didn't want to go, they sometimes escaped to West Berlin, and it was this kind of weird gray area where, yes, the police could find them, arrest them, and so on, force them. But I was the first generation where they said, okay, the wall is down, you guys have to go. You know, and they really wanted everybody to go. I mean, there were people in wheelchairs who had to go and had to do something.
Cannot imagine you in the army.
No. I'm really, I mean, I was, I was so, I could not believe this. I was like, no. Like, I'm not supporting the army, like, not, especially not this army. Like, I mean, the German army, like, it's not, like, I will never hold a gun to somebody's head. Like, you know, this is not me. I'm not a pacifist in that way, but I was like, this country killed my grandfather. I should fight for this guy. I should die for this country. For what does it actually stand for? You know, I still have a problem with that because I feel people talk about this. What does Germany mean? You know, what should we teach the immigrants? Like what, you know, and so on. But I don't really hear strong values. I think, for example, the Americans are at another level when it comes to that. You know, like they founded the country on certain values because everybody was a settler, basically. You know, so in Germany, yeah, where's that line? Yeah, this genetically, like you are like an Aryan, a Viking, whatever. You know, I don't know where is that line that people draw. You know, so I think it's very important to make it clear what do we stand for as a country. But then I'm going, why do I even care about Germany? I've felt European all my life, you know. So it's this conflict maybe of my generation, but I really feel this conflict. For me, I never felt German at all. Like I feel European, if I even feel like that. But it will also maybe that can change. You know, if Europe becomes something that I can't agree with at all anymore, then I wouldn't even feel like that anymore. So, and I think also, I mean, for example, what many people told me was kind of interesting. I think now people always say, let's say internationally, you go to Japan or America or something, and they go, you know, this is so German. Like you are so, I mean, you're the definition of this German let's tear everything down, like a radical guy or something, you know. So, and I'm like, it's weird because nobody in German would actually give me a credit like that, you know. They would go, no, you move, you know, move somewhere else, you know. And a lot of people were happy when I was in England. They were like, ah, this guy is gone, now we can move on, and there's not this critical voice all the time. Because for a while, I still felt part of the techno scene. I always thought, hey, like everybody should speak about the truth, you know. For example, I remember in 94, I think it was, 94, 95, the first sexual assaults were happening at the Love Parade. Unthinkable before. But it was like, let's not talk about this. It's like, wait a minute, it's getting bigger, and suddenly these drunken guys assault these girls. It was like larger numbers, you know, and I was like, you need to address this. You need to at least say, this is not what we want here. It's like, yeah, well, but we have these sponsorship deals, and Alec, well, why you're putting us in a bad mood again? You know, it was this kind of vibe at the time. So, but I think if you don't take care of these kind of problems, they will destroy your scene, I think.
How critical were you about the music industry at that point? Because you formed what we listened to earlier was sort of the first release on digital hardcore recordings. So it was for you, like right from the beginning, very important to have your own label. But then you also released on Mill Plateau, and later you released on the Beastie Boys label, Grand Royal.
I released on many labels also. There's a lot of white label stuff that was under different names and so on. I did a lot of stuff, yeah. So what's the question? What I did I like the music industry?
No, well, it's a very broad question. But I'm wondering, you being critical of politics in many ways, did it matter to you to stay in a certain underground place? Because Atari Teenage Riot became really famous, and you played big festivals, you toured the world, you played the US as much as Japan, etc., and released on, well, the Beastie Boys label, but still a very big label at that time. Did that ever pose a problem for you, or conflict?
No, because I'm not. I mean, I think if somebody in a more political environment would ask me that question, they always mean, hey, wait a minute, you are some sort of leftist guy, and this is against your principles or something, right? I mean, I'm not saying that you are asking the question, but for me to explain that, and I made that clear, like right from the start, like independence is super important. You have to control your career, and for me, for example, selling a lot of records wasn't a compromise or something bad. Of course, you always hear this, you know, like there's like, let's say you start out, you have these fans, they love you, okay, they were there the first shows, and you need these people, right? I mean, they're great. And then comes the point, suddenly your audience is way bigger, and they go, hey, you know, I went to the concert and Alec didn't even see me or something, you know. So, and then it becomes like a lot of people who were there, like in the underground times, they can get really mad, and then this whole thing starts. Yeah, they sell out, and now, you know, it's just commercial music and so on. Which is I don't know. I can only do the music I honestly want to make, and I can't think like that. So I can't go, I make something less good or less of something just in order to sell more records or less records or something. So I think as a musician, nobody should actually think like that. I think what is important, I think, that you avoid certain repetition, because I think that's a trap. What happens, I think, with a lot of musicians, they succeed with, let's say, one track, right? It becomes their track, it's a famous track, so on. So you get into this vicious cycle, because I think no musician actually fully understands why it was that track or that track. That's my theory. Like some people are going to go, yeah, but I did this, and then I thought about getting these blonde bikini women in the video, and I made that move, and this, of course, then it became a big hit. I think that we see tons of productions like that, and they don't become a hit. So I think it's a very chaotic environment, and you can't control every person. What do they like? What will they like? What will they like at that point in time when your record comes out, and so on. So it's an environment that you can't really control 100%. So that's why I think you need to stick to yourself. Like you need to say, this is what I want. I want to make progress. I want to challenge myself. I have different ideas. So I think a lot of the times when people try to repeat something, a success of the past, it never fully works. You can ride the wave a little longer maybe, but I never trusted that. So I think that's why every time I put something out, you would see maybe now on social media, fans who loved the previous record, they get mad and so on. But I know this since the early 90s. So I sold out tons of times to certain people's minds. I think what you need to do, I think, is also as a music fan, you need to set certain... you need to measure it somehow, okay? And I think you can measure stuff. Let's say if you have a track like this track you just played, Hunt Down the Nazis, okay? Yeah, it is very fast breakbeats at the time. It's 92. You know, the British stuff was all at 140 at the time. 30 BPM fast. It felt like absolute chaos to most people at the time. Now we're used to this kind of tempo a bit better. But then all the synth stuff was a direct influence. I never hid that from people from underground resistance. They used these kind of Roland machines like the MC202 and the 101 and 303 in this very certain type of way, very aggressive way. And I was like, okay, if we pair this with the sped up breakbeats, this will be something interesting. So I think don't be afraid to combine things in a new way. But that means you might offend some people, and some people, they expect you to deliver certain stuff, but you're not their slave. So, and I think that's really important for me. For example, like as a DJ, I remember I was like, yeah, I do my set, and there is always this kind of interaction with the crowd. I think the ideal DJ set is an interaction where you move with the audience together, but you need to sometimes push them in certain directions. You can't just only play what they want to hear. I think that we see that in EDM, right? I mean, in American, mostly American, I guess, EDM, people turn up with their USB stick. It's a pre-recorded DJ set because it has to sync up with the fireworks and the light show. So there is no interaction. There's nothing. It's a top-down hierarchy. They feed the music to an audience, and the original idea of DJing and techno, you could maybe even argue house and so on. But let's just speak about techno. That's not that idea. You need to change your set while you're doing it. You need to manipulate. It's like surfing a wave. You know, you need to navigate, and you cannot repeat the same thing again. You know what I mean? It's like if you see a rock band, let's say, they play their songs. Maybe they play them a little bit faster or slower, depending on how they feel. But I think a DJ set should be a musical statement. And it should not just be, okay, I just play some music to people and then I'm on my laptop surfing the internet. And I think it's a very dangerous thing. People say now maybe there's more money in electronic music, in especially events maybe. I think this laziness can bring the whole thing to fall. Because you need, the music always comes first. You know, if there's not the creation, the rest becomes meaningless, you know. So people need to focus on that. And many DJs disagree with me on this point. They think they should be the entertainer. They want this sort of fame, maybe, to be on a stage and on Instagram, and you see the photos with the big crowd cheering and stuff. But they see themselves as servants, like they serve the audience. I think I never saw it like that, you know.
Very early in our conversation today, you talked about wanting to manipulate people's thoughts. And with becoming more successful later, did it ever get to a point where you felt like you may be manipulating people too much?
No,
or how?
No. So I think that was a misunderstanding. I didn't want to manipulate people's thoughts. I wanted to take control over the sounds, so people's minds, they would at least maybe they would hear something else. They would maybe look at the world in a different way. I don't think you can manipulate people like that. You cannot like go, here's a song. Okay, I put it to you like this. I said very early on, I keep repeating this. When people ask me, what's your music supposed to do? And the first answer is, the music has to make people think. This is what it's supposed to do. That means, I think music is always a reflection of somebody's values. Okay, even if they're not aware of that. If you hear certain music and you can't agree with that, with the values, you will not like it. It's as simple as that. And that's, I think, what music is. So you need to, if you want to make a political statement, and I speak for myself. I say my opinion. If people can agree with that, and they often do. But I can't tell people, listen to this song, you must now think like I do. And by the way, like I'm very different to the industrial generation that was in the 80s, where it was a lot about presenting power. You know, it was a lot. People sometimes say, yeah, but there's Atari Teenage Riot, Alec Empire stuff. Is it not a bit like Ministry and Nine Inch Nails, all this stuff? And I'm like, no, it's actually completely opposite. Maybe some distortion sounds similar or something, but for us, it's when we use noise, for example, we never use noise as punishment. We always use noise as a sort of euphoria. It's like if you speed up everything, and it's like a sort of information overload. At some point, it ends in this noise with a lot of overtones, and your brain, you know, it's very exciting. If you experience that, like really experience that, it's like the peak of a musical experience. But in a lot of industry, it's like, you know, I mean, they even perform like that on stage, most of these acts. So it's almost like I mean, sometimes I can like music like that, but it has nothing to do with what we do.
I'm going to play just a tiny bit of you and Würzburg, Masami Akita.
Yeah.
I wanted to play this not at last. It's a live recording, by the way.
From CBGB's.
In New York, yeah.
Yes. I don't know if people remember that club. Do you know what CBGB's is, that club? No? Okay. Yeah, okay. Sure, you didn't, right? I mean, okay. So, yeah, you know. He doesn't. No, okay, CBGB's is this legendary punk club in New York where a lot of, I don't know, punk started maybe. Is that, I mean, the punk purist would argue with me, but Ramones, Blondie, Richard Hell, all these people, Suicide, all these people played in that club. It was not a big club. It was like, I think maybe 400 people fit in there. It's closed now. But at the time we went in there and did this show together, which was very unusual for this club because it's usually related. I mean,
Patti Smith, or
it was punk stuff, you know. So Very violent kind of show in terms of the music. Some people vomited, and it was very loud. This guy, Merzbow, he's a legendary noise guy from Japan. Like I love his stuff. He's done hundreds of releases, and we worked together on some stuff. But this live recording, at that time, we did a few like shows together where I was on turntables and I had a few machines, and he had at the time these weird instruments, like all analog noise stuff. And so we did these show together, and we actually did the first show in Berlin. What was the club called? It was some club in Mitte that, I mean, the building is totally different now. So I forgot the name. We turn up. It's a packed club. Everybody's like, oh my God, these two people now, they're going to play. And we're like, yeah, this is going to be great. And we start, and after like, I think 1 minute, the whole PA was blown, and it was like a huge disappointment. But then we were in Osaka, in Japan, a few months later, did it there. That was also great. But then CBGB's in New York was recorded, and that was that live recording. It's an interesting snapshot, I think, of where we were at the time, because my stuff was getting more noisy, and I was really connected with the Japanese noise scene that I loved. I think they were very innovative. It's an underrated scene, I think, in the West. The Japanese scene, they were real innovators. I mean, they push stuff so far. I remember I was in, I think, 95. I was in Japan, and I was DJing, and all these guys said, "I want to open up for Alec," and I was like, "Okay, yeah, cool." Like I knew some of them, and Merzbow I knew, and Keiji Haino and people like that, but we were in the old Liquid Room in Tokyo, and it was, at the time, it was like on the, I think, 14th floor or something. And that, to me, was already an amazing thing you have these, I don't know, 1,000 people go in an elevator, there were 10 people fit in, they go to this top floor. And then I experienced this, how people went absolutely crazy. I mean, for noise. I mean, the beats you're hearing there, these are my beats, okay, from my part. But they were just playing really like noise. I mean, like pure noise. And it was, you saw these people stage diving and flying. And I mean, and I was like, okay. It was funny, like, because I was starting to get a bit depressed about Berlin and about, techno, and another death of a music movement, and we always will fail. And I end up in Japan, I see this, I'm like, okay, this is like the future. I mean, okay, it didn't turn out to be the future, but it was very exciting. Oh, who knows? Maybe in 50 years' time,
everything has been the future at some point. So.
Exactly. So maybe people, they will have enough of the song structures. That's still my bet so far, that people get tired of the same thing, and maybe noise. The door is open, people just need to go through that door and have a good time.
I also wanted to play it just to give people an idea of the actually very big variety of things that you were doing in the late 90s. I mean, you also worked with Björk and released Björk, which I think is like super surprising for some people maybe. And I want to play a bit of this Game Boy only double album that I know you've talked about many times, but it also kind of sparked.
Maybe 15 years ago, not many times. It's just a joke. Okay, but go on. Okay, so this was from that. It's okay. A lot of what I often liked at the time.
I'm happy that it makes you so happy too.
No, because there is something. Okay, we talked about all the serious topics, but there's also the fun stuff is often the trolling. That's how I call it. I mean, and there was a lot of examples, and that's maybe one example. It was there was the Game Boy. There was like a little software created for it. You could have three sounds at the same time. Like it sounded like if you ever saw Space Invaders or something like that. You know, it's a okay. So I mean, you heard a bit of that, but this is actually 3 Game Boys running at the same time, out of sync into chaos. But I was like, okay, so this program was on the market, and we were like, hey. And there was already in the underground scenes like, hey, this is cool, like that you can do something with it. And I was like, yeah. And I released like this double gatefold vinyl record from that with only Game Boy stuff. This video is, she got this from YouTube. A director I knew did this kind of fun video at the time. It was part of a VJ mix that was on television during the night, and he played actually 3 tracks on top of each other. So it's a bit more chaotic than the record is. But then on the back there was this whole description, like a total diss. I mean, I have to say we mastered all our records in the 90s and even the decade later at Abbey Road in England, in London. And you know, it's like this, I mean, it's a bit childish, but a lot of the titles were like these anti-Beatles titles and stuff. And the mastering engineer, older guy, super nice guy who mastered all our stuff with us, and he was like, Alec, I can't do this here. Like, I can't even put this in the computer. Like, this is an insult to everybody. What are you doing? You know, like, the Beatles were the greatest band of all time. And I was like, yeah, but now the Game Boy, you have to understand, the Game Boy is replacing your old history. This
Game
is
Boy is
done.
replacing the Beatles.
You know, now music will be squeezed into a little gadget. I mean, now it's maybe not as funny because you have the iPhone and the smartphone. But at the time, people were like, no. This is not what music would sound like. So a lot of, I mean, what we didn't speak about yet was like at the time when I started, the small hacker community in Berlin was that was really part also of like my scene in a way. So often, yeah, it was also about, okay, we test something, we do something like that maybe. Of course, it has to be a double vinyl record mastered at Abbey Road. And you send this out to all the music critics, and they already, they hate you. Like, they're like, no, you know, 0. Like, can we get negative review points to that? I mean, sometimes certain people thought, this is great, this is the best record of the month or something. But there was always this little bit like, hey, don't have this heavy music history on your shoulders. Sometimes you need to shake it off, and you know, don't take these icons too serious from the past. You know, so this was also part of what was going on at the time. And I did this at the same time. I did this record, this mashup record, the Alec Empire versus Elvis Presley, which was more like a bootleg fun thing. I mean, I did this actually just for myself to play to my girlfriend at the time, who was an Elvis fan. And I watched all Elvis movies, like over 30 or something, in one go for like 2 weeks. I was totally, I was like, I was never an Elvis Presley fan, I have to add that. I didn't even listen to the records. And I was like, okay, I take all these samples, and I made these tracks. It was all like kind of breakcore stuff, like really weird programming, and all the Elvis songs were like time stretch and very. I mean, it's like a very strange record looking back now. But I went to Australia to do some shows with the Atari Teenage Riot. I gave a DJ that he really loved this. He was like, I need the burned CDR, and I've left it with him. And then a year later, I was in New York, and I saw these bootleg vinyl records in record stores. And I was like, where does this come from? Some Mexican label pressed this, and I was like, okay, I need to buy some for myself. And so my girlfriend split up. Like, she was angry, like totally angry. She's like, how can you do this to Elvis? And I was, but the interesting thing was, it was record of the week in New Musical Express, the British music newspaper at the time. So there was a certain recognition. I mean, then there was a sort of video being done for some music show on MTV, I think, and that ended up in MoMA a few years later.
In the Museum of Modern Art in New York, yeah.
As this early mashup, whatever, I forgot the definition, but I was like, okay, this is how sometimes things go. And certain people from the art world, this is why they even speak to me, you know. Before that, they would go, who is this punk, you know, like, to which university did he go? But then it's like, oh, wait, he has this, this was one of these early things, wow. So, I mean, so sometimes people need that stamp of approval, but don't try to go for that because you can't. This is something that's maybe out of your control. And this is a very good example of how crazy things sometimes can go.
You just spoke about sort of like the hacker community in Berlin, and I think that's also a very particular characteristic, I think you say, about Berlin is that there are so many software companies here. Like a lot of the DAW, like DAWs, are actually German, like Logic and Cubase and Pro Tools and all those things sort of go back to, you know, just a few people who started making that here. Now with a lot of other companies like Native Instruments and Ableton being here, how close were you to those developments? Did you just like beta test stuff, or do you care about it at all?
No, I mean, not this stuff, like, because I stuck to the Atari computer during the 90s. And then, I mean, we actually started using hardware recording, for example, the early Pro Tools with, like, I think it had 4 and then 8 tracks, audio tracks you could have. When I think what you're describing is really 2000 onwards.
Yes.
Also, where I wasn't really in Berlin at the time so much. I was never such a fan of the studio inside the laptop. I felt this was sort of like leading to sort of how can I say this? To a sound where everything sounds very similar. You know what I mean? Because I think now we left that phase again, like since a few years, so it's getting better. But at the time, a lot of the glitch, clicks and cuts stuff, and I felt, okay, people are using the same software. You could hear it immediately. My personal opinion was that I didn't like the sound in general. Like, it was not physical enough. And I think, I mean, we can do this today. Like, we could hook up an 808, a real 808 drum machine, and anything that comes from your laptop, and the 808 will sound like heavy and big, and the laptop will sound a little bit smaller. Maybe at some point, maybe it will sound the same, but so far it isn't. And for me, the physical impact of sound is very important.
And I would say that I'm pretty sure I know
I
people who would argue that and who would say that now the laptop sounds just a bit, if you have the right sound card, not with like my mini jack output. But
no, they have two problems maybe. They have one of two: either their ears are not trained well, or what's in between the ears is not.
It's not trained.
Yeah, because it's a physical fact. That doesn't mean you shouldn't. Try and work on that stuff and get it better, because we also have a lot of advantages from the technology. But I think, okay, going back to the hacker, to the link to the hacker scene, one thing I think that musicians should never buy into is that the latest gear is the best. This is something that we are in music here, okay? Like, this is. We talk about music. Somebody can use a Gibson guitar from the 50s and can write an amazing piece of music. So that's a trap, I think. Like, so a lot of times people go, okay, but we are doing electronic music, so always the latest thing will be the best. I really would question that. That can be true, but it can also be not true. And then you get to American dubstep, and everybody suddenly agrees with me. You know what I mean? So it's, but that explains it. You know, as soon when something comes along that people don't like, then it's the fault of the gear. I never think there's a certain gear fetish. I think we talked about this before. I'm not really into that. I mean, I use the Atari computer for certain stuff because it has a very fast MIDI attack, and it only does that thing quite well. And there's an interview, I think, for your website, right, about the Atari computer, because I actually see the computer as a key factor in the studio that changed the studio. And I'm often amazed by the fact that people leave that out. I mean, often when you hear about gear, people talk about all kinds of synths and stuff, but rarely about the computer.
Or software, for that matter.
Yeah, but it's like, I think, it's really, you have to master every tool you have available, and you have to find these ways, like, to make it work for you. And I think we know this. It's very easy. You have, especially in electronic music, you have certain stuff, like, let's say a certain software, and you start working with it or whatever, and I think it's a mistake when you treat it like almost like you're playing a video game. You know, I think we all know this effect. You go like, oh, suddenly an hour goes by. What have I actually done? What's the goal here? Well, why am I? Yeah, I have produced something, but was that actually me, or was it just the machine suggesting stuff to me in a certain way?
How would you get out of that?
You need to think about it first before you. I mean, I think you need to leave room for experiments. I think that's always do that, you know. But I think about, like, what do you actually want to do? Just people who randomly do trial and error stuff. I think it often leads to bad music. It's sometimes they can hit on something, but well, like the chance if we dug holes outside this building in the ground and we find oil or gold, we could try that forever and maybe we find something, you know, but you should be a bit smarter than that, you know. You can save some time.
We've soon talked for almost 2 hours, and so I 1.5, about, yeah, a bit more than that. I want to open it up to questions in a bit. There's a lot of things that you've done that we've left out. Atari Teenage Riot, split up.
The good stuff you left out. You just
we're gonna I am gonna play
like
a new
B-sides,
thing.
live recordings that nobody. Okay.
Well, yeah, but we want to play stuff that maybe people don't come across that easily. But still, Atari Teenage Riot split up. One band member passed away, Carl Crack, in I think 2001. And then you reformed. You worked as a producer with, for example, Patrick Wolf, and you did many solo recordings, and also you did film stuff. And so I want to play a part of the OST of Vault.
Okay.
The victims of authority.
Okay, that's
video.
That's a sort of clip that was done. That the soundtrack came out as a vinyl record early on in the year, and this clip was done from footage from the film. So it's not a scene from the film you see. It's sort of like I wouldn't call it a music video, but it's just so you know what you're watching. This is stuff from the movie and with music from the soundtrack, but it's actually not matched what's happening in the film.
Almost so strangely full circle with the video that we watched in the beginning.
Is it?
A lot of German police uniforms in today's talk.
Yeah.
But that's coincident because the movie is about, I think, a German police guy falling in love with the sister of a French refugee.
Yeah.
It's like...
This is the nice way to put it. The cop is is part of a raid in a refugee zone. It's a little bit like a few years into the future, this place. So, and he ends up, he gets into a fight with a refugee and kills him. And this is, the movie is about like he thinks he can handle this, and he's trying to hide this from the rest of the police. Police is very racist in the movie. Not all the police, but his team, because their job is always to go into these to kind of like control these refugees, and they can't get any jobs and stuff. So there's certain crime and so on. So they have this very narrow view of these people who live in that zone. So yeah, the movie was done. Was shot in 2015 in the fall, and I did the soundtrack last year in May. And I think it became kind of like, people talked about it because it was like the first film that had something to do with the sort of refugee topic. It was not done while this crisis was going on, but it was a little bit earlier. But I think because of that link, and also, of course, a lot of people were angry. Some critics were saying, of course, the police is all racist again. But it's like, that's the story, Nobody said every policeman is racist. It's just part of the reason why he, in the fight with the refugee, he goes that one step further, and he later on actually regrets it, even though in the beginning he felt like, okay, yeah, well, I had to do what I had to do. It's more about this inner conflict, like where do you actually draw the line? You're part of a certain authority, you wear this uniform, you have certain orders, but you also should have some sort of responsibility for your own actions, So it's interesting. Tarek Eli, the director, did this film. So.
And you worked sort of with usually when you write soundtracks, work with a finished film, not the other way around.
Usually, yeah. Like I like it. In this case, it was perfect because they were under real time pressure because they wanted to premiere it, I think, at Berlinale. But the Munich Film Festival said, we want this because of this theme, or the topic. So, and he was calling me up and said, I actually wanted to contact you in like 3 months or something, but we have like 5 weeks. Can you score the whole film? And I said, okay, like, wire the money, get me Red Bull sugar-free, and it's going to happen in time. So.
You like time pressure to work?
In this case, what I like is, in this case, I had total freedom, and I think that's actually good. When you know that somebody trusts you fully, and you can just completely get into the story and just write, and you don't have to go through this whole procedure of like, okay, maybe there's another producer and he thinks this is a bit too radical, and so I love it. It's time is good, I think. Trying to reach something within a certain time is fun.